Right now, as you're listening to this, your brain is making dozens of micro-decisions based on invisible psychological triggers you're completely unaware of. The temperature of this room, the time you last ate, even the subtle emotional residue from a conversation 3 hours ago. All of these are quietly steering your thoughts and choices in directions you never consciously chose. What if I told you that the majority of what you believe are your autonomous decisions are actually the result of sophisticated mental traps that have been operating in the shadows of your consciousness for your entire life? The ancient Greek philosopher Plato once described human consciousness through his famous allegory of the cave, where prisoners mistake shadows on the wall for reality itself. Today, modern neuroscience has revealed that Plato's metaphor was more prophetic than he could have ever imagined. We're all living in a version of that cave, mistaking the shadows of our unconscious conditioning for the full spectrum of our potential choices. But here's where it gets fascinating from an emotional intelligence perspective. These invisible traps aren't inherently evil or destructive. They're sophisticated survival mechanisms that evolved over millions of years to help our ancestors navigate complex social hierarchies, detect threats, and make rapid decisions with incomplete information. The problem arises when these ancient systems clash with our modern world, creating emotional patterns and decision-making processes that no longer serve our highest good. Consider this philosophical paradox. If our choices are being influenced by forces we're unaware of, can we truly claim to have free will? And more importantly, for those of us committed to developing emotional resilience and empathy, how can we cultivate authentic relationships with ourselves and others when so much of our inner landscape remains hidden from view? The renowned psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent decades studying what he called System 1, thinking, the fast, automatic, intuitive mode of decision-making that operates below conscious awareness. His research revealed that this system, while incredibly efficient, is also remarkably susceptible to systematic errors and biases. What makes this relevant to emotional intelligence isn't just understanding that these biases exist, but recognizing how they shape our emotional experiences and responses to others. Take someone like Marcus, a project manager who prides himself on being rational and objective. Marcus believes he makes decisions based purely on merit and logical analysis. Yet researchers following his decision patterns for 6 months discovered that his choices were heavily influenced by factors he never consciously registered. He was more likely to approve innovative proposals on sunny days, more critical of ideas presented by people whose voices reminded him of a difficult former colleague, and consistently more generous with feedback when he'd had his morning coffee versus when he hadn't. Marcus's experience illustrates what neuroscientists call environmental priming, one of several invisible traps that operate continuously in our psyche. But to truly develop emotional intelligence and resilience, we need to understand these traps not as isolated phenomena, but as interconnected systems that shape our entire emotional landscape. The first major category of invisible traps involves what I call emotional anchoring. This occurs when our current emotional state becomes unconsciously linked to past experiences, creating automatic response patterns that feel completely natural but are actually learned behaviors. Unlike simple conditioning, emotional anchoring operates through complex neural networks that integrate memory, emotion, and prediction into seamless patterns of response. Consider the philosopher William James's radical proposition that we don't run from the bear because we're afraid because we run from the bear. Modern neuroscience has validated this counterintuitive insight, revealing that our emotional experiences often follow our physiological and behavioral responses rather than preceding them. This means that many of the emotions we experience as authentic reactions to present circumstances are actually echoes of past patterns playing out automatically in our nervous system. Think about someone like Elena, a marketing executive who consistently felt anxious during team meetings but couldn't understand why. She attributed her anxiety to the pressure of presenting ideas, but through careful self-observation, she discovered something fascinating. Her anxiety spiked specifically when sitting in conference rooms with fluorescent lighting and beige walls, an environmental combination that unconsciously reminded her nervous system of her childhood dentist's office, where she'd experienced significant stress and powerlessness. This revelation transformed Elena's entire approach to managing her emotional state. Rather than trying to think her way out of anxiety or judge herself for feeling nervous, she began to understand her emotional responses as information about unconscious connections her brain was making. This shift in perspective, from seeing emotions as problems to be solved to viewing them as data to be decoded, represents a fundamental principle of emotionally intelligent living. The second major trap involves what behavioral economists call choice architecture. The way options are presented to us shapes our decisions in ways we rarely recognize. But from an emotional intelligence perspective, this goes much deeper than simple marketing manipulation. It touches on how we construct our sense of identity and purpose through the choices we make. Here's where it gets philosophically interesting. If our choices are being influenced by invisible architectural factors, what does this mean for our sense of authentic self-expression? The existentialist philosophers grappled with this question long before we had the neuroscientific data to back up their insights. They recognized that freedom isn't the absence of influence, it's the conscious engagement with the influences that shape us. The third invisible trap operates through what social psychologists call emotional contagion, our tendency to unconsciously absorb and mirror the emotional states of those around us. But this goes far beyond simply catching someone else's mood. It involves a complex process of neural mirroring that literally rewires our brain's emotional processing patterns based on our social environment. Research conducted by neuroscientist Marco Iacoboni revealed that our mirror neuron systems activate not just when we perform actions, but when we observe others performing those same actions. This means that when you're in the presence of someone who's chronically stressed, anxious, or emotionally reactive, your brain begins to practice those same neural pathways, even if you're not consciously aware of it happening. Consider David, a software engineer who prided himself on being calm and analytical. He couldn't understand why he'd started feeling increasingly irritable and scattered over the past few months. Through tracking his emotional patterns, he discovered that his shift coincided with his team getting a new manager, someone who, while competent and well-meaning, had a habit of speaking quickly, interrupting conversations, and displaying subtle signs of chronic stress through rapid gestures and shallow breathing. David's brain had been unconsciously learning these patterns, integrating them into his own emotional baseline without any conscious decision on his part. This wasn't weakness or lack of boundaries, it was his mirror neuron system doing exactly what evolution designed it to do: rapidly adapt to the social environment to promote group cohesion and survival. But here's the empowering insight. Once David understood this process, he could work with it rather than being unconsciously controlled by it. He began practicing what I call conscious emotional modeling, deliberately exposing himself to people whose emotional patterns he wanted to integrate while creating protective space from emotional influences that didn't serve his highest good. Perhaps the most subtle and powerful invisible trap involves what philosophers call narrative identity, the ongoing story we tell ourselves about who we are, what we're capable of, and what our experiences mean. This isn't just positive thinking or self-talk. It's the fundamental framework through which we interpret reality itself. The trap occurs because we mistake our narrative for objective truth, when in fact it's a highly selective interpretation influenced by countless unconscious factors. Our cultural background, our attachment style, our trauma history, even our current physical state. The story feels so natural, so obviously correct, that we rarely question its construction or consider alternative interpretations. Let's explore this through the experience of someone like Sarah, a nonprofit director who had always seen herself as someone who gives too much and attracts people who take advantage of her kindness. This narrative felt absolutely true to her lived experience. She could point to countless examples of relationships where she felt depleted and unappreciated. But when Sarah began examining this story more closely, she discovered something remarkable. Her narrative was actually preventing her from seeing evidence that contradicted it. She was unconsciously filtering her experiences to confirm her pre-existing story while overlooking instances where people did appreciate her contributions, where boundaries were respected, and where mutual support flourished. Understanding these invisible traps is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when we develop practical strategies for working with these unconscious influences rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. This isn't about eliminating these systems. That would be impossible and counterproductive. It's about developing what I call conscious partnership with the automatic processes of your mind. Strategy 1. The environmental audit. Begin by conducting a systematic audit of your physical and social environment, paying attention to patterns you might have never consciously noticed. This isn't about paranoia or over-analysis. It's about developing the kind of environmental awareness that allows for more conscious choice-making. Spend 1 week tracking your emotional states alongside environmental factors: lighting, temperature, noise levels, the emotional states of people around you, even subtle factors like colors and scents. Don't try to change anything yet, simply gather data. You might discover, like Elena did, that certain environmental configurations consistently trigger emotional responses that have nothing to do with your current circumstances. The key insight here is that environmental awareness isn't about control, it's about choice. Once you understand how your environment influences you, you can make conscious decisions about how to work with those influences rather than being unconsciously subject to them. Strategy 2. The narrative archaeology method. This involves systematically excavating the stories you tell yourself about your experiences, examining them not for truth or falsehood, but for their construction and their consequences. The goal isn't to find the right narrative, but to recognize that narrative is always a choice, and that different stories create different possibilities for action and relationship. Begin by identifying one recurring pattern in your life that you find frustrating or limiting. Write out the story you typically tell yourself about this pattern, why it happens, what it means about you, what it says about other people. Then, deliberately construct 3 alternative narratives that could explain the same set of facts. The point isn't to convince yourself that any particular story is true, but to experience the felt sense of how different narratives create different emotional responses and possibilities for action. This practice develops what philosophers call narrative flexibility, the ability to hold multiple interpretations lightly rather than being trapped within a single explanatory framework. Strategy 3. The mirror neuron practice. Since we're constantly influenced by the emotional patterns of those around us, we can become more intentional about curating our emotional environment through what I call conscious modeling. This involves deliberately exposing yourself to people whose emotional patterns, communication styles, and ways of being you want to integrate into your own system. This might mean spending more time with that colleague who remains calm under pressure, listening to podcasts hosted by people whose communication style you admire, or simply paying closer attention to the emotional qualities you naturally gravitate toward in others. Your mirror neuron system is always learning. The question is whether that learning is happening consciously or unconsciously. Strategy 4. The choice point practice. This involves developing the ability to recognize what I call choice points, moments when you become aware that you're about to respond automatically to a situation. These moments represent opportunities to pause and ask, what invisible influences might be operating right now, and how do I want to respond given that awareness? The practice isn't about always making different choices, but about making choices consciously rather than automatically. Sometimes the automatic response is perfectly appropriate. The difference is that when you're operating from conscious choice rather than unconscious conditioning, your responses tend to be more flexible, more contextually appropriate, and more aligned with your deeper values and intentions. Strategy 5. The integration protocol. The final strategy involves developing what neuroscientists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thinking and emotional processes while they're happening. This creates what the philosopher John Dewey called reflective experience, the capacity to learn from your own psychological processes in real time. Practice spending a few minutes each day in what I call consciousness observation, simply noticing the flow of thoughts, emotions, and sensations without trying to change or judge them. Pay particular attention to moments when you feel pulled toward automatic responses, when certain emotions arise seemingly out of nowhere, or when you find yourself making assumptions about other people's intentions or motivations. This isn't meditation in the traditional sense. It's more like becoming a friendly scientist of your own consciousness, gathering data about how your mind operates under different conditions. Over time, this develops a kind of psychological flexibility that allows you to work skillfully with whatever arises in your experience. What we've explored today raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, choice, and authentic living. If so much of what we experience as our thoughts and emotions are actually the product of invisible influences, what does it mean to be genuinely ourselves? The answer, I believe, lies not in eliminating these influences, which would be impossible, but in developing a more conscious relationship with them. True emotional intelligence isn't about having perfect control over your inner experience. It's about understanding the complex web of factors that shape that experience and learning to dance skillfully with them. This perspective transforms our entire relationship to personal growth and emotional resilience. Instead of seeing ourselves as broken systems that need to be fixed, we can understand ourselves as incredibly sophisticated processing systems that are always responding intelligently to the information available to them, even when that response doesn't serve our conscious intentions. The invisible traps we've discussed aren't barriers to authentic living. They're the very mechanisms through which consciousness emerges and evolves. The trap lies not in their existence, but in our unconscious relationship to them. When we understand how environmental priming, emotional anchoring, social mirroring, and narrative construction operate in our daily lives, we gain something invaluable: the capacity for conscious participation in our own psychological evolution. We move from being unconscious products of our conditioning to becoming conscious collaborators in our own becoming. This doesn't mean we achieve perfect self-awareness or eliminate all unconscious influences from our lives. It means we develop what I call conscious unconsciousness, an ongoing, friendly relationship with the vast intelligence operating below the threshold of our awareness. The goal isn't to become invulnerable to influence, but to become more skillful in how we're influenced. It's about developing the capacity to recognize when we're operating from authentic choice versus automatic conditioning, and creating more space for conscious response in the moments that matter most. Remember that developing this kind of awareness is itself a practice of empathy, both toward yourself and toward others who are navigating the same invisible influences in their own lives. When you understand how unconscious these processes can be, you naturally become more compassionate toward the automatic responses and seemingly irrational behaviors you encounter in yourself and others. As you move forward from here, I invite you to approach this exploration with curiosity rather than judgment, with patience rather than urgency. The invisible traps that shape your choices have been operating for your entire life. Transforming your relationship to them is a gradual process that unfolds through consistent, gentle attention rather than forceful intervention. If you found value in today's exploration of the invisible influences shaping your emotional experience, subscribe for more insights into the fascinating intersection of neuroscience, philosophy, and practical emotional intelligence. Your consciousness is far more vast and mysterious than you might imagine, and that's exactly what makes this journey of discovery so endlessly rewarding.